The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a courier in a black suit who didn't smile, didn't make small talk, and disappeared before Elena could sign for it. Hello, my lovely family, and welcome to Noir Heirloom Tales. Before we begin, let me say this: you matter, and your presence here is never ordinary. If you're watching right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Don't forget to like this video and turn on your notifications, because the stories here are meant to be felt, not just heard. This channel is where dark romance, power, and emotion collide, and once you start listening, it's hard to walk away. Every story pulls you deeper, every ending leaves you wanting more. So stay close, get comfortable, because what you're about to hear will follow you long after this moment. Let's begin. Elena knew what it was before she opened it. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind of paper that whispered wealth in every fiber, black with gold embossing. Her name written in elegant calligraphy that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Ms. Elena Castellano. Not Mississippi. Not Dear Elena. Just her name, formal and cold, like she was being summoned to court. She set it on her desk and stared at it for 20 minutes. The office around her buzzed with the usual chaos. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, her assistant popping in twice to ask about the Morrison account. But Elena couldn't focus. Couldn't breathe properly. Because she knew exactly who had sent this, and she knew it wasn't a peace offering. Damian Wolfe didn't do peace offerings. Finally, when the weight of anticipation became unbearable, she slid her finger under the seal. The paper gave way with a soft tear that felt far too intimate, too invasive. Inside was a single card, gold-leafed edges catching the afternoon light streaming through her office windows. You are cordially invited to the Wolfe Industries annual gala. Saturday, October 14th. 8 p.m. The Wolfe Tower, penthouse ballroom. Black tie required. Her hands didn't shake. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction, even though he wasn't there to see it. But her jaw tightened as she read the handwritten note at the bottom, penned in that distinctive scrawl she'd once found charming. Don't embarrass yourself by not showing up. Everyone who matters will be watching. D. Elena read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The arrogance was staggering, even for him. The casual cruelty wrapped in formal politeness. The unspoken threat that hung between every carefully chosen word. Everyone who matters will be watching. Translation: if you don't come, I'll make sure the entire city knows you're afraid of me. That you're still broken. Still under my control. Bastard, she whispered. She should throw it away. Burn it. Send it back with a reply so cutting it would make him bleed. But she did none of those things. Instead, she placed the invitation carefully back in its envelope and tucked it into her desk drawer, her mind already spinning with calculations she didn't want to make. Across the city, 73 floors above the streets that never slept, Damian Wolfe stood at the window of his corner office and smiled. His reflection stared back at him. Sharp jaw, dark hair styled with deliberate carelessness, a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Behind him, the city sprawled like a kingdom he'd conquered piece by piece. Did she get it? Marcus, his COO, asked from the doorway. She got it. Damian didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel the trajectory of the day unfolding exactly as he'd planned. And you think she'll actually show? She'll show. His voice carried absolute certainty. She won't be able to help herself. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You know, people are already talking about this. About her. About why you'd invite your ex-fiancé to the biggest corporate event of the year. Let them talk. Damian finally turned, his expression unreadable. That's the point. Is it? Marcus challenged carefully. He was one of the few people who could. Because from where I'm standing, this looks personal. Damian's smile turned sharp. Dangerous. Everything's personal, Marcus. You should know that by now. He crossed to his desk, a massive structure of glass and steel that commanded the room, and picked up his own copy of the invitation. He'd had them printed on specialty paper, the gold foil imported from Italy. Every detail perfect. Every element designed to remind Elena of exactly what she'd walked away from. And what she'd never be able to escape. "She left me at the altar 3 years ago," Damien said quietly, his tone conversational but laced with something darker. "In front of 400 people. Left me standing there like a fool while she disappeared without a word, without an explanation, without even the decency to face me. I remember. Do you know what that does to a man like me? To be humiliated like that." Damien's fingers tightened on the invitation, creasing the expensive paper. "To have your name dragged through every gossip column and business journal, while people whisper about what you must have done to drive her away." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Damien, this gala isn't just an event, Marcus. It's a stage. And Elena is going to walk onto it, in front of everyone who watched her destroy me, and she's going to remember exactly what happens when you cross Damien Wolf." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. "What are you planning?" Marcus asked finally. Damien's smile returned, cold and calculating. "You'll see. Everyone will see. That's rather the point of a spectacle, isn't it?" He dismissed Marcus with a gesture and returned to the window, his reflection sharp against the darkening sky. Below, the city lights flickered on one by one, like stars bowing to his presence. In 3 days, Elena would walk through his doors again. Into his territory. His world. And this time, when she tried to run, he'd make sure there was nowhere left to hide. Elena sat in her apartment that night, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her, staring at the invitation she'd brought home. Her phone buzzed. Her sister. "Did you really get invited to the Wolf Gala? Jessica just texted me. She saw it on some event planning forum. El, please tell me you're not going." Elena's thumb hovered over the reply button. She should say no. Should block the number, burn the invitation, forget Damien Wolf ever existed. But even as she thought it, she knew the truth. She was going to that gala. Not because he'd commanded it. Not because she was afraid of what people would say if she didn't. She was going because 3 years ago, she'd run from him to save herself. And now she needed to prove, to him, to everyone, but mostly to herself, that he no longer had the power to break her. Even if facing him again might destroy what little peace she'd built. Her phone buzzed again. Then again. More messages flooding in as words spread through their old social circle. Elena turned it face down and took a slow sip of wine, her decision crystallizing into something hard and sharp and unbreakable. 3 days, she whispered to the empty room. The invitation seemed to gleam in the lamplight, gold edges catching, and holding the glow like a warning. The grand ballroom of the Castellano estate glittered like a cage made of diamonds and lies. Elena Moretti stood at the top of the marble staircase, one hand resting lightly on the polished banister, the other holding the small, warm hand of her daughter. On her other side, an identical little girl gripped her fingers with the same quiet intensity. Both children wore matching cream-colored dresses, their dark hair pulled back in neat ribbons, their expressions far too serious for 5-year-olds. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. But Vincent Castellano didn't extend invitations, he issued summons. And 3 years away hadn't changed that fundamental truth about the man who once shattered her world. "Mama," whispered Sophia, the twin on her left. "There are so many people." "We stay together," Elena murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Always together." Lucia, her other daughter, said nothing. She simply tightened her grip, her dark eyes scanning the crowd below with an awareness that sometimes frightened Elena. Lucia saw too much, understood too much, just like her father. The thought made Elena's stomach clench. She descended the stairs with practiced grace, her deep navy dress flowing around her like water, expensive and understated in a room full of women draped in obvious wealth. She'd learned that true power didn't announce itself. It simply existed, undeniable and absolute. The crowd parted as she moved through it, conversations stuttering and dying in her wake. She felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispered questions that followed her like ghosts. Is that Elena Moretti? I thought she was dead. Whose children are those? They look exactly like Elena. His voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. She stopped. Her daughters stopped with her, flanking her like small sentries. Elena didn't turn immediately. She couldn't. 3 years of building walls around her heart, and the sound of her name in his mouth nearly brought them crashing down. When she finally faced him, she made sure her expression revealed nothing. Vincent Castellano stood 10 feet away, immaculate in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut, his gray eyes, those devastating gray eyes, fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin burn. He looked older, harder. The boyish edge that used to soften his features had been carved away, leaving only brutal masculine beauty and something darker lurking beneath the surface. His gaze dropped to the twins. Elena watched the exact moment recognition flickered across his face. The slight widening of his eyes. The tension that suddenly corded through his shoulders. The way his hands flexed at his sides, as if resisting the urge to reach for something he'd lost. "Vincent," she said, her voice cool and professional. "Thank you for the invitation." Invitation. He repeated the word like it tasted wrong. His eyes hadn't left the girls. "You disappeared for 3 years without a word, and you think I invited you here?" Sophia pressed closer to Elena's side. Lucia simply stared at Vincent with unnerving directness, her small face expressionless. "I had my reasons," Elena said. "I'm sure you did." His voice was soft. "Dangerous. Are you going to introduce me?" Every instinct screamed at her to run. To take her daughters and disappear into the night. To vanish so completely that not even Vincent Castellano's considerable resources could find them. But she'd learned something important during her 3 years away. Running solved nothing. It only delayed the inevitable. "Sophia. Lucia." She squeezed their hands gently. "This is Mr. Castellano. An old friend of mine." "Friend." Vincent's laugh held no humor. He took a step closer, and Elena had to force herself not to retreat. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "It's what we are." She met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch. Nothing more. Nothing less. Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, or pain, or some volatile combination of both. He looked at the twins again, and Elena could practically see him calculating. Counting backward. Remembering. "They're 5, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Their birthday." Elena's jaw tightened. December 15th. The exact date was 9 months after the last night she'd spent in his bed. The night before she'd discovered the truth about his business. The night before everything fell apart. Vincent's face had gone very still. "Elena. Don't." She cut him off, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Not here. Not now." "Then when?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, that familiar scent of cedar and smoke that used to cling to her skin in the mornings. "When were you planning to tell me I have daughters?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irreversible. Around them, the party had gone quiet. Every conversation had died. Every eye was fixed on the tableau they created. The notorious Vincent Castellano, the woman who'd vanished from his life 3 years ago, and 2 little girls who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the most dangerous man in the city. Elena felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "They're not yours," she whispered, the lie burning her tongue like acid. "They're mine." Vincent leaned in, his mouth near her ear, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You always were a terrible liar, Elena. It's one of the things I loved most about you." Loved. Past tense. The word shouldn't hurt as much as it did. "Mr. Castellano." A new voice interrupted, smooth and cultured. "My apologies for the intrusion." Elena turned to see a tall man with silver hair and calculating eyes standing beside them. She recognized him immediately: Anthony Greco, Vincent's second-in-command, and the closest thing the Castellano family had to a conscience. "Anthony," Vincent said, his tone making it clear the interruption was unwelcome. "There's a situation that requires your immediate attention." Anthony's gaze flicked to Elena, something unreadable in his expression. "In your study." "It can't wait." Vincent's jaw clenched. For a long moment, Elena thought he might refuse. Might demand that she stay, that she answer the questions burning in his eyes. Instead, he stepped back, his face smoothing into the cold mask she remembered so well. "This conversation isn't finished," he said. "It never started," Elena replied. He turned away, his shoulders rigid with barely contained tension. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he looked back one last time. His gaze moved from Elena to her daughters, his daughters, and the raw hunger in his eyes made her breath catch. "You can't hide them from me anymore," he said quietly. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever reason you had for running, it ends tonight." Then he was gone, swallowed by the glittering crowd, leaving Elena alone with her daughters and a truth she could no longer contain. Lucia tugged on her hand, her small face tilted up, her dark gray eyes, Vincent's eyes, far too knowing. "Mama," she said softly. "That man. He's our father, isn't he?" Elena's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Ballroom cast prismatic light across 500 faces. Faces that belonged to senators, oil magnates, tech giants, and old money dynasties whose names were whispered in boardrooms across 3 continents. Alexander Morgenstern stood at the altar in a custom Brioni tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, his jaw set with the same iron confidence that had built his empire from nothing. He didn't love Isabella Rothschild. Love was a luxury he'd never been able to afford, even now that he could buy small countries. But Isabella was perfect in every way that mattered to a man like him. Polished, poised, connected to the right families, and crucially, she understood that their marriage was a merger, not a romance. The officiant droned on about eternal commitment, while Alexander's mind calculated the quarterly projections for the Southeast Asian expansion. His phone buzzed in his inner pocket, twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. He ignored it. Nothing was more important than this moment, this consolidation of power disguised as holy matrimony. Isabella stood beside him in a Vera Wang gown that had taken 8 months to create. Her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo that showcased the 20-carat diamond necklace at her throat. She was smiling that practiced smile she'd perfected at finishing school in Switzerland, the one that never quite reached her pale blue eyes. Behind them, the massive oak doors stood closed, guarded by security personnel who'd been vetted more thoroughly than CIA operatives. No interruptions. No surprises. Everything controlled, everything perfect. Alexander's phone buzzed again. And again. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His assistant knew better than to contact him during the ceremony unless the building was literally on fire. Even then, it would need to be multiple buildings. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony," the officiant intoned, his voice echoing through the cavernous space, "let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The traditional pause hung in the air like held breath. Alexander's lips curved slightly, as if anyone would dare. His phone erupted in a continuous vibration that he could feel against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Then the doors exploded open. Not literally, that would come later, but with enough force that the sound ricocheted off marble columns like a gunshot. Every head in the ballroom swiveled toward the intrusion. Alexander's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, toward the phone that wouldn't stop screaming for his attention. But he didn't look at the doors. Not yet, because something in the quality of the silence that followed made his blood run cold in a way that hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations never had. "Alexander." Isabella's voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. "Alexander, what is that?" He turned slowly, every instinct he'd honed over 15 years of cutthroat business, screaming that he didn't want to see what had silenced 500 of the world's most powerful people. The woman standing in the doorway looked like she'd walked through hell to get there. Her dark hair, still that same midnight black he remembered tangling his fingers in, hung loose around shoulders barely covered by a thin jacket. Jeans. She was wearing jeans to his wedding, and a white t-shirt that had seen better days, probably better years. But it was her face that stopped his heart. Evelyn. Her green eyes locked onto his across the impossible distance of the aisle, and for one suspended moment, the entire room ceased to exist. Just her. Just him. Just the echo of a night 5 years ago when he'd been someone different, before the money, before the power, before he'd learned that people like him didn't get to keep people like her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Evelyn said, and her voice carried through the ballroom with a steadiness that belied the slight tremor in her hands. "But I think the groom should know he has a son." The phone slipped from Alexander's fingers. He didn't hear it hit the marble floor. Didn't hear the collective gasp that rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Didn't hear Isabella's sharp intake of breath, or her mother's scandalized shriek from the third row. All he could hear was the word son echoing in his skull like a death knell. Evelyn stepped further into the ballroom, and that's when he saw the small hand clutched in hers. A boy, maybe 4, maybe 5, with Alexander's own storm-gray eyes and Evelyn's devastating bone structure peeked out from behind her legs. The child wore a dinosaur t-shirt and light-up sneakers that blinked red with each hesitant step. "His name is Julian," Evelyn continued, and now he could hear the tremor, could see the way her fingers tightened protectively around the boy's hand. "And before you marry her, before you promise forever to someone else, I thought you should know that you already promised forever to me. That night at the Parker Hotel, before you became this." Her gesture encompassed his tuxedo, the ballroom, the empire he'd built on ruthlessness and calculated risks. "You told me we'd figure it out together. Remember?" Alexander's mind reeled backward, grasping for memories he'd locked away in a vault labeled weakness. The Parker Hotel. A charity gala he'd crashed while still building his first company, still hungry, still desperate to prove himself to a world that had written him off as nothing. She'd been a graduate student, working the coat check to pay her tuition, and when she'd smiled at him, really smiled, not the empty social smile everyone else wore like armor, he'd felt something crack open in his chest. One night. He'd given himself one night to be human instead of a hunting predator. And then he'd disappeared, blocked her number, convinced himself it was mercy, that she deserved better than what he was becoming. "Get her out of here." Isabella's voice cut through his paralysis like a blade. "Security. Someone remove this woman and her. "Say it," Evelyn challenged, her chin lifting with a defiance that sent something dark and possessive coiling through Alexander's gut. "Say what you were going to say about my son. Your fiancé's son." Julian pressed closer to his mother's leg, and those gray eyes, his eyes, tracked Alexander with an intelligence far too knowing for a child that age. The boy raised one small hand in an uncertain wave, and Alexander Morgenstern, the man who'd never lost a negotiation, who'd crushed companies and egos with equal precision, who'd built an empire on the principle that emotion was weakness. Alexander felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. His phone, forgotten on the marble floor, continued to buzz with messages he'd never read. Behind him, Isabella's breathing had gone sharp and dangerous. Around them, 500 phones were already recording, already uploading, already destroying everything he'd built. But all Alexander could see was the boy with his eyes and the woman he'd convinced himself he'd never see again. "We need to talk," Evelyn said quietly. And for the first time in 15 years, Alexander Morgenstern had absolutely no idea what to do next. The moment Luca's hand closed around the small, warm fingers, the entire ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked down, confusion flickering across his features before hardening into something unreadable. The boy, no more than 4 years old, stood perfectly still beside him, his grip surprisingly firm for someone so small. There was no fear in those dark eyes. No hesitation. Just a quiet certainty that made Luca's chest constrict in a way he didn't understand. "Papa," the child said again, softer this time, as if the word itself was a secret between them. The whispers started like wildfire. Guests leaned toward each other, hands rising to shield their mouths as they spoke. Camera phones emerged from designer clutches and jacket pockets. Luca could feel every eye in the room burning into him, waiting for his reaction, hungry for the scandal that was unfolding in real time. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was frozen, staring at this child who had appeared from nowhere and called him father with such devastating confidence. Beside him, Vivian's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and pale gold liquid. The sound snapped through the murmurs like a gunshot. "What is this?" Her voice was low, dangerous. The mask of the perfect bride was cracking, revealing something venomous underneath. "Luca, what the hell is this?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Because across the ballroom, standing at the edge of the crowd with her chin raised and her shoulders squared, was Elena. And she was holding another child's hand. A girl this time. Identical dark curls. The same set to her jaw. The same eyes that were currently staring at him with an expression far too knowing for someone so young. Twins. The word slammed into Luca's consciousness with the force of a physical blow. His gaze snapped between the boy at his side and the girl standing protectively close to Elena, and the truth he'd been too blind, too arrogant, to see before hit him all at once. The timeline. The timing of Elena's disappearance. The reason she'd vanished without a trace 5 years ago, leaving nothing behind but questions and the ghost of what they'd shared. These children were his. "Luca." Vivian's voice had risen now, sharp enough to cut glass. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped his arm, nails digging through the fabric of his tuxedo. "Answer me. Who are these children?" But Luca couldn't tear his eyes away from Elena. She stood there like she was made of stone, dressed in that simple black dress that somehow made every other woman in the room look overdone. There was no apology in her expression. No explanation offered. Just that same quiet defiance she'd always carried, the one that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. The one that had made him feel alive when everything else in his carefully constructed world felt like a prison. "Mama said we could see you today," the boy beside him said, his voice clear and steady in the suffocating silence. "She said it was time." Time. The word echoed through Luca's mind as fragments of memory began clicking into place. The night Elena had left. The single conversation they'd had, her voice trembling as she'd tried to tell him something important, something he'd been too consumed with a business deal to fully hear. He'd promised they'd talk later. Later had never come. "You knew." Vivian's accusation cut through his thoughts. She'd released his arm and taken a step back, her face pale beneath expertly applied makeup. "You knew about this, and you were going to marry me anyway?" "I didn't," Luca started, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. Because even as he formed the denial, he wasn't sure it was entirely true. Hadn't there been moments over the past 5 years when he'd wondered? When Elena's sudden disappearance had seemed too absolute, too final. When he'd caught himself looking at children in passing and doing unconscious math in his head. He'd buried those thoughts, drowned them in work and expansion and the empire that demanded everything from him. But they'd been there, lurking in the spaces between his carefully maintained control. "Luca Moretti." Elena's voice rang out across the ballroom, and the crowd parted instinctively as she moved forward, her daughter's hand still firmly in hers. She walked like a queen approaching a throne she'd never wanted, but had learned to claim anyway. "We need to talk. Now." The authority in her tone sent a ripple through the gathered guests. This wasn't the timid personal assistant they might have remembered from years ago. This was someone who had survived whatever hell Luca's world had put her through and emerged harder, stronger, dangerous. "You dare show your face here?" Vivian moved to intercept Elena, her wedding dress rustling like the warning hiss of a snake. "On my wedding day? With some elaborate scheme." "They're not a scheme." Luca's voice cut through the confrontation, quiet but absolute. The kind of tone that had built an empire and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. "Stand down, Vivian." His fiancée, God, was she still his fiancée, stared at him with an expression of pure betrayal. "You can't possibly believe. Look at them." Luca finally released the boy's hand, though the absence of that small touch felt like losing something essential. He gestured between the two children who stood like mirror images of each other, of him. "Look at them and tell me you don't see it." The silence that followed was deafening. Because everyone could see it, the resemblance was undeniable. These children carried the Moretti blood in every feature, every gesture. They were living proof of a secret that had just detonated in the center of the most important alliance his family had arranged in decades. Elena stopped a few feet away, close enough that Luca could see the slight tremor in her hands despite her controlled exterior. Close enough that he caught the familiar scent of her, jasmine and something else, something that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights. "Their names are Marco and Aria," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "And they're 4 years old. You can do the math. Marco, Aria." Their names settled into Luca's chest like stones, heavy and permanent. "Why now?" The question emerged rougher than he intended. "Why bring them here today of all days?" Something flickered in Elena's eyes. "Pain, maybe. Or regret. Because you left me no choice. Because you were about to bind yourself to a family that would see my children as threats to be eliminated." She glanced at Vivian, then back at him. "And because they deserve to know their father before your choices make that impossible." The accusation in her words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Around them, the wedding guests had become a jury, watching and judging and recording every moment of this spectacular disaster. Luca's security team had materialized at the edges of the crowd, waiting for orders. His mother stood frozen near the altar, her face ashen. His business partners were already calculating the cost of this revelation, the deals that would unravel, the alliances that would fracture. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, crumbling. And in the center of it all stood Elena, holding their daughter's hand while their son looked up at him with eyes that demanded something Luca had never learned to give. "Trust." "Papa," Marco said again, and this time there was a question in it, a hope that felt like shattered glass against Luca's ribs. Before he could respond, Vivian laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made several guests flinch. "This is perfect. Absolutely perfect." She turned to face the crowd, her voice rising. "Did you all see this? Did you witness what this man has done?" But Luca wasn't listening anymore. He was watching his daughter, whisper something in Elena's ear. Watching Elena's expression shift from defiance to concern. Watching as Aria pulled away from her mother and walked forward with the same fearlessness her brother had shown. She stopped directly in front of Luca, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that shouldn't have been possible for someone so young. "Mama cried every night for a year," Aria said simply. "She tried to call you 147 times. I counted." The words landed like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. 147 times. Luca's hands clenched at his sides as the implication sank in. She'd tried. Elena had tried to reach him, tried to tell him, and somehow, through his own choices or the interference of others, those calls had never made it through. "I think," Elena's voice cracked slightly before she steadied it. I think it's time we had that conversation you were too busy for 5 years ago. She held out her hand toward Marco, who immediately moved back to her side. The three of them stood together, mother, son, daughter, a unit that Luca had unknowingly created but had no place in. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on what came next. Luca looked at Vivian, then at his mother, then at the hundreds of guests who had come to witness a union that would never happen now. The wreckage of his carefully planned future lay scattered around him like the shards of Vivian's broken champagne flute. And somehow, impossibly, he felt more alive than he had in 5 years. "Clear the room," he said quietly. "Everyone out. Now." The crystal chandeliers above cast fractured light across 500 faces, all turned toward her like flowers seeking sun. Isabella stood at the center of the wedding hall, her red dress a deliberate wound against the sea of pastel elegance. The string quartet had gone silent mid-note, their bows frozen above instruments worth more than most people's cars. She could feel Marcus's stare from the altar like a physical weight, pressing against her spine, willing her to turn back. To disappear. To become the convenient ghost he'd tried to make of her 6 months ago when he'd emptied their shared accounts and left nothing but lawyers' letters in his wake. But Isabella hadn't survived a childhood in Chicago's grittiest neighborhoods by knowing when to disappear. She'd learned when to become unforgettable instead. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Her voice carried through the gilt-edged silence, steady and clear. Not apologetic at all. "But I thought everyone here should know they're witnessing a marriage built on fraud." The murmurs started like wine through wheat fields. Whispers cascading from the back rows forward, guests leaning toward each other, phones already emerging from designer clutches and tuxedo pockets. Catherine's face had gone the color of her white lace gown. Her father, Senator Whitmore, rose from his seat in the front row, his jowls reddening. But it was Marcus who held Isabella's attention, Marcus, whose perfectly knotted tie suddenly looked like a noose, whose tan seemed sickly under the chandelier's harsh clarity. "Security," he said, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "Someone get security." "Oh, they're already here." Isabella reached into the small clutch at her side, red like her dress, like her lipstick, like the rage she'd carried for 183 days. She pulled out a folded document, its edges crisp and white, along with a few lawyers. "And according to the state of New York, you might want to hear this before you make your vows." Marcus took a step forward, descending one level from the altar. His hand was outstretched like he might physically stop her from speaking. "Isabella, you're making a scene. This is the truth." She opened the document slowly, deliberately. Let the sound of unfolding paper echo through the cavernous hall. The truth about how Marcus Caldwell built his tech empire? She could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. The same eyes that had promised her forever over breakfast in their Tribeca apartment, that had traced her collarbone on lazy Sunday mornings, that had looked straight through her when he'd decided she was no longer useful to his ambitions. "The truth," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength from his fear, "is that every patent, every algorithm, every single piece of code that made Caldwell Industries a multi-billion-dollar company came from me. From my work, my late nights, my innovations." The murmurs grew louder. She saw reporters in the crowd, real ones, not just society page photographers. They'd been invited to document New York's wedding of the year. Now they were documenting its funeral instead. "That's absurd," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its power. He looked to Catherine, to his groomsmen, to his lawyer standing near the third row. She was just a consultant. Entry level. This is harassment." Isabella laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut. "Entry level? Is that what we're calling it now?" She held up the document higher. "This is a forensic audit of your company's intellectual property, Marcus. Every filing, every timestamp, every piece of documentation. All of it traced back to my personal devices, my accounts, my work, done while we were still married." She watched the color drain from his face completely now. The algorithms that power your flagship software? Developed on my laptop at 2 in the morning while you were entertaining clients. The security protocols that landed you the government contract? Based on my dissertation research. The AI integration that made you the darling of Silicon Valley? My code. All of it. Mine. Senator Whitmore was on his feet now, his face purple. This is a wedding, not a courtroom. If you have accusations, I have proof. Isabella's voice cracked like a whip through his bluster. Proof that Marcus Caldwell systematically stole proprietary work from his then-wife, filed patents in his name alone, and built a fortune on intellectual theft. Proof that's already been submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the U.S. Patent Office, and 3 separate law firms as of 9 o'clock this morning. The hall erupted. Guests were standing now, phones raised, voices overlapping. She could hear Catherine crying, a high-pitched sound of betrayal and humiliation. Could see Marcus's groomsmen backing away from him, distancing themselves from the toxic cloud of scandal forming around him like a visible miasma. You signed a prenup, Marcus said, his voice desperate now, grasping. You have no legal claim. A prenup that covered assets acquired during marriage. Not intellectual property that was mine to begin with. Isabella took 3 steps forward, close enough now to see the sweat beating at his temples. Not work that I created that you stole, that you profited from while leaving me with nothing. Did you really think I'd just disappear, Marcus? That I'd stay quiet while you married a senator's daughter and cemented your empire on the foundation of my stolen work? She could feel the power shifting in the room, feel the way the crowd's energy had turned from shocked disapproval of her interruption to hungry anticipation of his fall. This was New York society. They loved nothing more than watching an empire crumble. The board of directors received their copies of the audit an hour ago, Isabella continued, her voice softer now but somehow more devastating. Your investors have been notified. And by tomorrow morning, every major news outlet will have the full story, complete with timestamps, source code comparisons, and witness statements from 14 former employees who watched you steal my work in real time. Marcus's knees seemed to buckle slightly. He reached for the altar's edge to steady himself, and the gesture was so vulnerable, so completely destroyed, that Isabella felt something dark and satisfied unfurl in her chest. 10 minutes, she said quietly, for his ears alone as she passed him, heading toward the exit through the parted crowd. That's all it took to ruin what you spent 6 months building. Poetic, isn't it? How quickly empires fall when they're built on lies. She was almost to the double doors when his voice stopped her, broken and raw. I loved you. Isabella paused, turned, met his eyes across the devastated grandeur of his wedding hall. No, Marcus. You loved what I could give you. There's a difference. The doors opened before she reached them, and Isabella stepped out into the Manhattan afternoon, leaving behind the wreckage of a man who'd mistaken her silence for surrender. Her phone was already buzzing in her clutch, her lawyer, her accountant, and 3 voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize. But it was the Blacktown car waiting at the curb that made her pause. The tinted rear window rolled down slowly, revealing a face she'd seen only in Forbes articles and gossip columns, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and a smile that promised danger wrapped in expensive Italian wool. Ms. Torres, Dante Moretti said, his accent kissing each syllable. I believe we have much to discuss about the future of Caldwell Industries, and perhaps your role in its more profitable resurrection. The door swung open like an invitation to a darker game than the one she'd just won. Isabella hesitated for only a heartbeat before sliding into the leather-scented darkness beside him. The moment stretched like shattered glass, beautiful, dangerous, and irreversible. Elena stood frozen in the center of the grand ballroom, her champagne-colored wedding gown suddenly feeling like a costume she'd been foolish enough to wear. The bouquet of white roses and peonies trembled in her hands as she stared at the woman who'd just walked through those towering doors. The woman whose face had drained of all color. The woman whose eyes were locked on Adrian with a mixture of devastation and disbelief that made Elena's stomach drop like a stone into deep water. Adrian! The woman's voice cracked across the marble floors, silencing the string quartet mid-note. What is this? Adrian's hand, which had been resting possessively on Elena's lower back just seconds ago, went rigid. She felt him tense beside her, felt the shift in his breathing, and in that single moment of his hesitation, Elena understood with horrifying clarity that she'd made a terrible mistake. The warmth of the golden lighting suddenly felt artificial. Mocking. Sophia! Adrian's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a confession. That single word, that name, spoken with such unguarded shock, told Elena everything she'd been too blind to see, too desperate to acknowledge. This wasn't just any woman. This was the woman. Elena's fingers loosened on the bouquet. She didn't even feel it slip from her hands, didn't hear it hit the floor with that soft final sound. All she could focus on was the way Adrian was looking at Sophia. Like she was the only person in the room. Like the past 3 months. Every dinner, every carefully crafted conversation, every promise, had been nothing but elaborate pretense. You said she was gone. Sophia's voice shook with barely contained fury. She stood in the doorway wearing a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back, no jewelry except for a silver watch Elena recognized immediately. Adrian's watch. The one he'd claimed he lost. You told me she left the country. You said, her voice broke. You said she wanted nothing to do with you. The guests began murmuring. Elena could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward them, could sense the shift in the atmosphere from celebration to spectacle. Her father was halfway out of his seat at the family table. Her mother's face had gone pale. Even Dominic, Adrian's closest friend and best man, looked genuinely shocked. Elena turned slowly to face her groom. Adrian! He wouldn't look at her. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. His eyes remained fixed on Sophia with an intensity that felt like a physical wound. Sophia, you need to leave. Now! Leave! Sophia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only pain sharp enough to cut. I've been gone for 3 months. 3 months because you told me she needed you, that you owed her family, that it was just a business arrangement. She stopped, her gaze finally shifting to Elena. But this doesn't look like business, Adrian. This looks like a wedding. The word landed like a slap. Elena's hands had gone numb. The diamond bracelet Adrian had given her that morning, a wedding gift, suddenly felt like a shackle. She remembered his words as he'd clasped it around her wrist. You're mine now, Elena. Completely mine. She'd thought it sounded romantic. Possessive in that dark, thrilling way that had drawn her to him in the first place. Now those words tasted like ash. It's not what you think, Adrian said, finally moving. But he moved toward Sophia, not toward Elena. That single step spoke volumes. Elena watched him cross the space between them, watched him reach for Sophia's arm. The other woman jerked away from his touch like it burned. Don't! Sophia's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. Don't you dare touch me. Not when you're standing there in a tuxedo, not when there's a woman in a wedding dress who clearly has no idea who you really are. Elena felt something inside her chest crack. Not break, not yet, but fracture. Someone want to explain what's happening? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Too calm, too controlled, like she was watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away, like it was happening to someone else. Adrian turned back to her, and for the first time since the engagement, Elena saw something real in his eyes. Panic. Guilt. The mask he'd worn so perfectly for 3 months was finally slipping, and beneath it was a man she didn't recognize at all. Elena! How long? She cut him off, her voice still eerily steady. How long have you been with her? 2 years, Sophia answered when Adrian remained silent. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice had steel in it now. We've been together for 2 years. We were talking about marriage, about a future. Until 3 months ago when he suddenly told me his family needed him to marry someone else. That it was temporary. That it didn't mean anything. The murmurs grew louder. Elena could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, could sense her father rising from his seat. But she couldn't look away from Adrian's face. Couldn't stop cataloging every micro-expression, every tell she'd somehow missed. You lied to me. The words came out flat. Empty. About everything. No. Adrian shook his head, taking a step toward her now. Not everything. The business arrangement was real. Your family needed. My family. Elena felt something hot and vicious rise in her chest. You're going to stand there and blame my family? You pursued me, Adrian. You showed up at my office, at the charity galas, at the restaurant. You made me believe. She stopped, forcing herself to breathe. What did you make me believe? That was the question that cut deepest. Because looking back now, Elena couldn't identify a single moment where Adrian had actually said he loved her. He'd said she was beautiful. He'd said she was perfect for him. He'd said marrying her made sense. But love, that word had never crossed his lips. She'd just assumed, filled in the blanks with her own desperate fantasies. Adrian's silence was answer enough. Elena took a step back, and the sound of her heels on marble echoed through the ballroom like a countdown. 1 step. 2. Creating distance between herself and the man she'd almost legally bound herself to. The man who was still looking at another woman like she was the only thing keeping him breathing. Elena, please. Adrian's voice finally broke. Let me explain. Explain. She laughed, and it sounded wrong even to her own ears. Explain what? That you used me? That this entire thing was, what? A convenience? A way to make her jealous? She glanced at Sophia, who was still standing in the doorway like a ghost at a feast. Or maybe it was real for you in some twisted way. Maybe you convinced yourself you could have both. It wasn't like that. But Adrian's denial sounded weak even to him. Then what was it like? Elena's voice rose now, all that careful control finally cracking. Tell me, Adrian. Tell me what I was to you. Because I need to know. I need to understand how I stood here, in front of everyone I know, wearing this dress, holding those flowers, ready to promise you my entire life. And the whole time I was just, what? A placeholder? The word hung in the air like poison. Adrian's face went pale. You were never a placeholder. But I was never her either. Elena's eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of 300 witnesses who were watching her humiliation unfold in real time. That's the truth, isn't it? I was never her. She looked at Sophia again, really looked at her. Saw the way the woman was trembling, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Saw the matching devastation written across her features. They were both victims here. Both played by the same man who'd stood between them and made them each believe in different versions of a future that had never really existed. Elena bent down slowly, picked up her bouquet from where it had fallen. The white roses were already starting to bruise where they'd hit the floor. She stared at them for a long moment, then looked up at Adrian one final time. I hope she was worth it. Her voice was steady again. Cold. Because you just lost everything. She turned and walked toward the side exit, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost. She didn't run, didn't rush, just walked with her head high and her spine straight, even though every step felt like walking through glass. Behind her, she heard Adrian call her name, heard the chaos erupting. Her father's angry shout, her mother's cry, the explosion of voices as 300 guests reacted to the scandal unfolding before them. But Elena didn't look back. She pushed through the side doors into the cold night air, and only then, only when she was alone in the darkness, did she let the tears finally fall. The boardroom had never felt this quiet. Isabel stood at the head of the table, her hands resting calmly on the leather portfolio that contained every piece of evidence she'd gathered over the past 3 months. Contracts, emails, wire transfers, photographs, a complete map of Adrian Blackwell's empire, and more importantly, every crack in its foundation. Around her, 12 board members sat in various states of discomfort. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others stared at the documents she'd distributed with expressions ranging from shock to carefully concealed fear. At the far end of the table, Adrian's chair sat empty. He'd refused to attend. That was his first mistake. As you can see from the financial statements on page 17, Isabel continued, her voice steady and clear, Mr. Blackwell has been systematically moving company assets into offshore accounts under shell corporations. The total amount diverted over the past 2 years exceeds $400 million. Margaret Chun, the eldest board member and one of Adrian's supposed allies, cleared her throat. Mrs. Blackwell. Ms. Lauron, Isabel corrected smoothly. I've filed for divorce. The papers were served this morning. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. She watched them exchange glances, recalculating their positions, weighing their loyalties against their legal exposure. Ms. Lauron, Margaret began again, her tone more careful now. These are serious allegations. If what you're saying is true, it is true. Isabel opened another folder, sliding a stack of photographs across the polished wood. These were taken over the past 6 weeks. Mr. Blackwell meeting with Viktor Kozlov, who, as you all know, is currently under federal investigation for money laundering. With Samuel Torres, whose construction company has been linked to 3 separate corruption scandals. And here, she tapped one particular image. With Chun Industries CEO discussing a merger that would violate at least 4 different conflict of interest clauses in his contract. Margaret's face went white. The room erupted into urgent whispers. Isabel remained still, letting the chaos wash over her without touching her. This was what power felt like. Not the false authority Adrian had wielded through intimidation and manipulation, but real power. The kind that came from preparation, patience, and the willingness to burn everything down if necessary. The door slammed open. Adrian stood in the doorway, his suit immaculate as always, but his jaw tight with barely contained fury. His eyes locked onto Isabel with an intensity that would have destroyed her 6 months ago. Would have made her apologize, back down, disappear. Now, she simply looked back at him. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was low, dangerous, vibrating with the kind of rage that preceded violence. Conducting a board meeting, Isabel replied calmly, which you were invited to attend. Your absence has been noted in the minutes. He moved into the room with predatory grace, his presence filling the space the way it always did, commanding, overwhelming, designed to make everyone else feel small. You have no authority to call a board meeting. You have no position in this company. You're nothing but the holder of 32% of Blackwell Industries shares, Isabel interrupted. She watched satisfaction bloom in her chest as Adrian stopped mid-stride. Which I acquired through our prenuptial agreement. The one your lawyers assured you was ironclad. The one that entitled me to shares as compensation for. What was the phrase? Substantial personal sacrifices made in service to the marriage. Adrian's expression shifted from rage to something more calculating. Those shares were meant to be symbolic. A gesture. Then you should have read the fine print more carefully. Isabel turned back to the board. Combined with the proxies I've secured from other shareholders over the past month, I now control 47% of voting shares. Enough to call meetings. Enough to demand audits. Enough to remove board members who've enabled illegal activities. You're bluffing. But Adrian's voice had lost some of its certainty. Isabel pulled out one final document, placing it on the table with deliberate care. This is a letter from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've opened a formal investigation into Blackwell Industries' financial practices. I've been granted whistleblower protection. And every person in this room who knew about these activities and did nothing. She let her gaze sweep across the table, watching them squirm. Will be held accountable. The silence that followed was absolute. Adrian stared at her across the length of the boardroom, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or desire or cold calculation. She saw fear. You'll destroy everything, he said quietly. The company, the reputation, everything we built. Everything you built on lies. Isabel closed her portfolio. I'm simply telling the truth. She gathered her materials, sliding them into her briefcase with practiced efficiency. The board members watched her with a mixture of awe and terror, none of them daring to speak. As she walked toward the door, Adrian moved to block her path. Up close, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the pulse hammering in his throat. He smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. You can't do this, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. Isabel, we can fix this. Whatever you want. I want my children, she said simply. And I want you to stop pretending you're a good man. She stepped around him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Behind her, she could feel his stare burning into her back, could sense the moment when his shock began transforming back into rage. Let him rage. Let him threaten and scheme and try to rebuild what she'd torn down. She had already won. The elevator doors opened, and Isabel stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, she caught one last glimpse of the boardroom. Adrian standing alone beneath the massive crystal chandelier, his empire crumbling around him, finally understanding what it meant to have power taken away. The elevator descended, and Isabel allowed herself one small smile. Marcus was waiting in the lobby with Elena and Lucas, both twins looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. Her daughter clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit. Her son had chocolate on his chin from the cookie Marcus had obviously given him. Ready to go home? She asked, kneeling down to their level. Are we going to the big house? Elena asked. Isabel thought of the penthouse Adrian had chosen, filled with sharp edges and cold marble, and rooms that echoed with loneliness. No, sweetheart. We're going somewhere new. Somewhere that's just ours. She stood, taking each small hand in hers. Marcus held the door open as they stepped out into the evening air. The sun was setting over the city, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Behind them, Blackwell Tower rose against the sky, all glass and steel and carefully constructed lies. Isabel didn't look back. They walked toward the car, her children chattering about dinner and bedtime stories, their voices bright with the resilience of youth. Marcus loaded their bags while Isabel buckled the twins into their car seats, pressing kisses to their foreheads. As they pulled away from the curb, Elena called out from the back seat, "Mama, is Daddy coming to the new house?" Isabel met her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. "No, baby. Daddy's going to stay at his house. But you'll still see him. But not you. Not me." Elena considered this for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. She went back to playing with her rabbit, and Lucas began singing a nonsense song, and the moment passed as easily as breathing. Isabel's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. This isn't over. She deleted the message without responding, then powered off the phone entirely. The car merged into traffic, carrying them away from everything she'd known for the past 5 years. Away from the woman who had bent and broken and nearly disappeared. Toward something undefined but entirely hers. In the fading light, Isabel caught her reflection in the window. Face calm, shoulders straight, eyes clear. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She looked like someone who had finally learned that the greatest power wasn't domination or control or fear. It was the courage to walk away. The iron gates of the Castellano mansion stood like judgment itself, cold, unyielding, and designed to keep certain people out. Tonight, Dante Moretti was one of those people. He stood in the rain, his $5,000 suit clinging to his shoulders, his perfectly styled hair now dripping water down the sharp edges of his face. The CEO who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, who made grown men stammer with his silence, who built an empire on the bodies of his competitors, that man was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. Through the ornate bars, he could see the warm glow of the mansion's interior. Somewhere inside those walls was Isabella, the woman he'd destroyed, the woman he'd underestimated, the woman who'd walked away from him with her head high and her heart shattered, leaving him with a taste of his own medicine, abandonment. He'd tried calling, 73 times in 2 weeks to be exact. Each call went to voicemail. Each voicemail went unanswered. He'd sent flowers, jewelry, handwritten letters that took him hours to compose because he'd never had to explain himself to anyone. Ever. All returned, unopened. So here he was at midnight, standing outside her family's estate like some lovesick fool. Except Dante Moretti didn't do love. He did possession, control, victory. At least, that's what he'd told himself for 34 years. The security camera above the gate shifted, its red light blinking. Someone was watching. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Didn't retreat. He'd faced down mafia bosses, negotiated with cartel leaders, stared into the barrel of a gun without flinching. But the thought of Isabella looking at him through that camera and choosing to do nothing, that terrified him in ways bullets never could. The intercom crackled to life. But it wasn't Isabella's voice. Mr. Moretti. Marco Castellano's voice was ice-wrapped in Italian silk. Her brother. The surgeon with hands that saved lives and eyes that promised to end his if he stepped out of line. I thought we made it clear. You're not welcome here. Dante stepped closer to the intercom, his voice low and rough. I need to see her. What you need is irrelevant. What she needs is for you to disappear. Marco. Dr. Castellano to you. The correction was sharp, deliberate. You lost the privilege of familiarity when you humiliated my sister in front of your entire social circle. When you made her believe she was your equal, then reminded her she was just another transaction. Each word landed like a physical blow, and Dante took them. Deserved them. I know what I did. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're just a rich bastard who got bored of his toys and now wants them back. Dante's hands curled into fists at his sides, rain streaming down his face. She's not a toy. She was never. His voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. I made a mistake. Silence. Then Marco's laugh echoed through the intercom, bitter and humorless. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday, Moretti. What you did was calculated cruelty. You built her up just to watch her fall. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about your midnight redemption arc. The intercom went dead, but Dante didn't move. He stood there, soaked through, staring at that mansion like it held the only thing in the world that mattered. Because it did. Somewhere behind those walls, Isabella was probably trying to forget he existed. Moving on with her life. Healing from the wounds he'd inflicted with surgical precision. And he couldn't let that happen. Not because he was entitled to her forgiveness, but because he'd finally understood something that terrified him more than any business deal gone wrong, any enemy at his throat, any bullet with his name on it. He loved her. The realization had hit him 5 days after she left, when he'd walked into his penthouse and found it exactly as she'd left it, clean, organized, perfect. No trace of her except the faint scent of her perfume on his pillows. She'd erased herself from his life, so completely it was like she'd never existed. Except she had. And now there was an Isabella-shaped hole in his chest that nothing could fill. I'm not leaving. He said it to the camera, to the rain, to whoever was listening. His voice was steady now, carved from the same steel that built his empire. I'll stand here all night if I have to. Every night. Until she tells me herself to go. Nothing. Just rain and silence, and the weight of his own sins pressing down on his shoulders. Then movement. A light flickered on in a second-floor window. Through the sheer curtains he saw her silhouette, smaller than his memory of her, or maybe the distance just made her seem fragile. She stood there, unmoving, a ghost watching a ghost. His heart slammed against his ribs. Isabella. He breathed her name like a prayer, even though she couldn't hear him from this distance. But she could see him, drenched and desperate. The powerful Dante Moretti, reduced to a man begging for scraps of attention from the woman he'd thrown away. She didn't open the window, didn't signal or acknowledge him in any way. She just stood there, watching. And for the first time in his life, Dante Moretti understood what it meant to be powerless. Then her hand moved to the curtain. Everything in him tensed, hope and dread tangled together in his chest. She pulled the curtain closed. The light went out, and Dante was left in the darkness, with only the rain and his regret for company. But he didn't leave, because redemption, he was learning, wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, one cold, miserable night at a time. From her darkened window, Isabella watched him through a gap in the curtains she hadn't fully closed. Her hand pressed against the glass, trembling with the effort it took not to go down there. Not to let him in, not to forgive him, because forgiveness was what he wanted, what he expected. Men like Dante Moretti always got what they wanted, eventually. But Isabella Castellano had learned something in the weeks since she'd walked away from him. She'd learned that the power wasn't in being chosen. It was in doing the choosing. And tonight, she chose to let him stand in the rain. Tomorrow? Well, that remained to be seen. What do you think Isabella should do? Does Dante deserve a second chance, or should she leave him in the cold? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're hooked on this dangerous love story, click that subscribe button, because next chapter is about to change everything. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when pride collides with passion.